Climate Change Minister James Shaw and Forestry Minister Peni Henare launched consultation on changes to the emissions trading scheme this week, floating a series of options to reform. Also, cyclone recovery and climate change continue to be forefront in our national concerns. We asked the Prime Minister this morning how involved are Māori in these conversations.
I think Māori will absolutely be consulted and absolutely have their interests considered in the decisions that we take forward from here. One of the reasons that we're reviewing the emissions trading scheme is that we do think that there's more that can be done to support native forest, indigenous forestation. We also are concerned that the emissions trading scheme isn't necessarily working as it was intended. So it was intended to provide incentives to reduce emissions, not just to offset emissions. And yet we've seen evidence that actually emitters are increasingly just choosing to offset their emissions through plantation of pine forests, for example, rather than actually reduce their emissions. And the goal here has got to be to bring emissions down.
And so you're absolutely certain that the government will take Māori feedback into account?
Oh, absolutely. Māori will be incredibly important. One of the reasons that we're doing consultation is so that all of the communities affected can have their say, and Māori communities will absolutely be listened to as part of this process.
Okay. A similar situation has evolved over the Kermadec Ocean Sanctuary, with Māori concerned that their fishing rights will be extinguished. Again, a Māori part of the decision-making there.
Look, I'm disappointed by that. We've spent 5 years working with Māori to try and find a solution here. This is a very rarely fished part of the ocean. There isn't a lot of fishing happening there. It's a very, very, very small effect turning it into a sanctuary. And actually, I believe as kaitiaki for the planet, we've got a responsibility to act in this area. So obviously, I'm disappointed that Tokum have stepped away from this, because I think we owe it to future generations to make sure we are protecting our marine areas, and that we're fishing sustainably. And so, look, we'll continue to look to find a way forward here.
Okay, let's turn to health. Te Whatuora is now using an equity adjuster score, which aims to reduce inequity in the system using an algorithm to prioritise patients and give Māori equitable treatment they've potentially missed out on for years. How are you managing the pushback from the sector and from the public on this? Because obviously flack isn't something you'd want to in an election year.
Look, I understand the controversy around it, but let's put some facts on the table. One is clinical need will always be the number one driving criteria in terms of determining who gets access to healthcare. Second, if you've got an urgent clinical need, you will get seen regardless of the ethnicity that you have. But third, we've got clear evidence now that Māori people, Pacific people, those who are from rural communities and those who are from low-income households are missing out on healthcare. They are waiting longer for clinical healthcare than patients in other demographics. And that's not fair. Our health system shouldn't have that level of, even if it's unintended discrimination, there shouldn't be that level of discrimination in the health system. So I think it's right that our clinicians are working hard to make sure that access to healthcare is equitable. I think it's important that they make sure that they don't replace one form of discrimination with another form of discrimination, and I know that that's what they'll be working hard to achieve.
Well, staying with health, recent data from the Ministry of Health shows that a 17% drop in vaccination rates for Māori babies. Some are calling for the responsibility for immunising children to be moved from GPs to the community health organisations, since the pandemic proved that this was a successful strategy in reaching whānau Māori. Is this something that you would consider?
I think we need to, draw on every lesson that we've learned from the global pandemic around how we can do vaccinations faster and more efficiently. I do think we've got to acknowledge, though, that we're dealing with a bit of a backlash around vaccination in some communities, and partly because of the sort of, misinformation that was spread around COVID-19 vaccines. We're seeing more hesitance amongst some parents to have their babies and to have their young children vaccinated. I think that's a tragedy, because it is absolutely better for those children to be vaccinated. And so, I think those community groups that you just mentioned can have a really active role here in making sure that communities know that not only is vaccination safe, but it's actually the best thing for their child.
Ka pai. Okay, you're heading to China on a diplomatic and trade mission. Firstly, who will be in the delegation and what are your top priorities while you're there?
So in addition to taking a media contingent, I'm taking about 30 business leaders on a trade delegation to China. I think New Zealand's trading relationship with China is incredibly important. It's our biggest export market internationally. It continues to grow. When I look back on some of the history about where our relationship with China started, it was a couple of $1 million a year. Now it's billions and billions of dollars a year. It's huge for the New Zealand economy. So that opportunity to continue to strengthen our trading relationship, that opportunity to talk about other international issues, to open doors for our business community over there, I think we will all get a lot out of the visit.
Is Foreign Affairs Minister Nanaia Mahuta part of the delegation?
No, she's not. She's been to China separately. Obviously, we try and maximise the bang for buck we get from these trips by having ministers often heading in different directions. And she's got a very full international schedule as well. She's already visited China this year, but I've got the Minister of Trade and the Minister for Tourism coming with me on the trip as well.
Education. Now, last week, the nationwide education provider Te Pūkenga, which has around 10,000 staff, announced that it would cut more than 400 jobs around the country. Why has this restructure taken so long, leaving staff with so much uncertainty, and why so many job cuts?
Well, first of all, can I acknowledge the uncertainty and can I acknowledge the difficulty any of these sorts of restructuring processes have for people? It's not a nice thing to have to go through, and I understand that. Te Pūkenga, so our network of politics around the country, have seen a relatively steady decline in enrolments in recent times, and that is something that they have to adapt to. So they have to look at making sure they're continuing to operate sustainably, and that does mean moving their resources to where there is student demand, and where there isn't, unfortunately, they have to make some difficult choices. There's also a drive to consolidate functions across the country so that the system's operating as efficiently as possible. And again, I acknowledge that that can create uncertainty and difficulty for people. But again, I think we will get a better vocational education system out of the other side of it. We've just got to get through this process.
Well, we'll leave it there. Prime Minister of New Zealand, Chris Hipkins, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Tēnā rā mā te koe.
Kia ora.